Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
I'm recording this on Thursday, and I'm already looking forward to the gigantic Thanksgiving spread I'm going to eat on Monday. You don't need me to tell you that I'm lucky, and not all of us can do the same. What you might not comprehend is just how many of us are hungry. It's a staggering number, and it keeps climbing. I'm sure that some of you listening to this podcast meet the definition of food insecure. It is a broad term that covers a wide range of situations. But when you are food insecure in this country, your best option, heck, it's basically your only option, is to go to a food bank, which, incidentally, is where our politicians go on weekends like this one to have their pictures taken while handing out food, helping Canadians. As our guest points out today, food banks are not a solution. And if we really wanted to change the lives of hungry Canadians, we'd turn away those politicians at the door, deny them the photo op, and tell them to go do the real work to feed this country. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Dr. Valerie Tarasuk is the principal investigator at Proof, which is a food insecurity research group, as well as Professor Emerita at the Department of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Toronto. Hey, Val.
Hi.
Thanks so much for coming back on the show. We've spoken about this before.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm happy that you're continuing to take an interest in this topic.
Well, especially as we head into this weekend when so many of us are thankfully giving thanks for giant tables stuffed with food, but how many of us are not?
Well, that's a really, really troubling fact, right? That the most recent data we have on food insecurity in Canada is from 2023, so it's not exactly at the moment. But at that point, we had 22.9% of Canadians living in food insecure households. So living in households that had some struggle to afford the food they need. Everything we know about this problem would suggest that that number hasn't gotten any lower since 2023, that if anything, now the numbers are higher.
The last time we spoke, which I think we were talking about 2022 or 2021 data, we were talking about how the pandemic had supercharged food insecurity. And I guess now that I know it's not over, but the restrictions and the economic hit of it have eased a little bit, has any of that increase abated? Have we seen any downturn? I'm asking this thinking I sadly know the answer.
We haven't. What we've seen is the opposite. We've seen a real upswing in the rates of food insecurity across the country over this last couple of years. And I think, yes, the horrible restrictions and, the really frightening things that went on through the early part of the pandemic have passed, thank goodness. But what we've got instead right now is rampant inflation. Mm-hmm. And that is really, really taking a toll on people's ability to meet basic needs. And I think that's what these numbers are telling us.
I think a lot of people, especially again around this time of year, will see reporting about food banks and the number of people using them. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But maybe it's worth just sort of zooming out for a second and defining food insecurity as a general term. Is it just people who use food banks? What is it?
So, at least in Canada, the term is used to refer to people that have inadequate or insecure access to food due to financial constraints. And I'm using that language, inadequate or insecure, and due to financial constraints very deliberately, because the way that we measure and monitor food insecurity in Canada is using an 18-item questionnaire that is run on very, very large nationally representative surveys. And that's what it's asking people. It's asking about their ability to meet their food needs. And, have they run out of food? Have they gone hungry without eating because of a lack of money for food? So it's a very particular problem. And the public face of it is food bank use, no question. And that continues to be the case. But when we look at the numbers, the number of people using food banks is typically like a quarter or a fifth of the number who report food insecurity. So that's why it's really important that we have all this monitoring that happens at the level of Statistics Canada, and that we can track these numbers in a way that goes beyond, people turning up in community programs.
When we ask people with that 18-question survey, do we ask why or sort of how severe it is? Do we have any sense of that?
Yeah. The reason there are 18 questions is because it's designed to pick up the level of severity. So the questions range from, do you ever worry about running out of food and not being able to buy more for yourself and your family because of a lack of money? That's the simplest one. So just people worrying. And then there are a few questions about compromises in the quality of what people are eating. Like, have you not been able to feed yourself or your children with balanced meals in the last, year? And if yes, how frequently has that been an issue? But the majority are asking about quantitative deprivation. So people going hungry without eating, skipping meals, cutting the size of meals because of a lack of food and money for food. And at its most extreme, going whole days without eating. So the scale moves from worry through qualitative compromises to quantitative compromises, because that's our scale of severity. And sadly, what we can see from the statistics nationally is that not only has the number of people living in food insecure households risen, but the severity of the experience has increased. So we have more and more people at the bottom of the scale reporting not eating at times because of a lack of food or money for food. So yeah, this is a very serious problem. And the direction of the changes that we've observed over these last few years is really, really frightening.
Do we know where in this country the need is most pronounced?
I know this isn't going to be very satisfying, but the truth is it's coast to coast to coast. Extremely high rates of food insecurity in Nunavut, but across the country, we've seen very marked rises in rates. So, there's some differences between the provinces, but all of them are sitting at high levels, and all of them have shown significant increases over the last couple of years. The lowest one is Quebec, but even in Quebec, we've seen increases. And the highest is, I think, in 2023, I think it was Prince Edward Island. But, Newfoundland and Labrador, Alberta, there are lots of provinces that are high. So it's not like, apart from the really horrific conditions in the north, it's not like we've got a pocket of this problem anywhere. It's really across the board.
You mentioned that food banks are kind of the public face of this problem. What do we know about how many people are using them and how well they're able to keep up with demand?
Well, what we're hearing is that, demand is through the roof. And I don't know about you, but I live in downtown Toronto, and I can see that demand is through the roof. I'm riding my bicycle and I can see food banks with lineups blocks long in areas that are in the downtown core. And I think this is the story probably across the country, that anybody who's anywhere where there's a food assistance organization operating can see the increase in demand, because it's just, we're seeing these huge, huge lineups. So we're seeing reports that it'll be probably sometime in November when we see a report from Food Banks Canada with statistics that are national. But at the local level, we're seeing reports all over the place about dramatic rises in the number of people seeking assistance. And in Toronto, the latest reports, I think, from Daily Bread are saying something like 1 in 10 Torontonians now are using a food bank. And one of the things that I think is interesting, they're reporting massive increases in the amount of money that they're spending to purchase food to serve that population.
And when we look at the data, do we have any demographics, I guess, on who is the most food insecure, or just on who is food insecure, and how that is maybe changing as it becomes more pronounced?
So yes, certainly from the national monitoring data, we have a lot of information about who's got the problem. And it might surprise you who it is. We can see that people who are Black or Indigenous are much more likely to be in food insecure households than white people. And, this problem is very, very much racialized. We can also see differences based on age. And this might surprise you. So it's racialized, but also the problem seems to be centered in working-aged adults and their family. So the lowest rates of food insecurity are amongst seniors, particularly those over 75. But the higher rates are, children and working-aged adults. very, very high likelihood of food insecurity amongst people reliant on social assistance. That's provincially administered programs, either welfare or disability support programs. And we can see, something like 70% on the last national survey were food insecure. And those people are much more likely to be severely food insecure, which I think speaks to the really, really low incomes that provinces are providing to people on social assistance, especially those on welfare. But the majority, like I say, it's working-aged adults and their families. And the majority of food insecure in Canada are actually people relying on employment incomes. They're people in the workforce. About 2/3 of food insecure households are relying on employment. It also relates to housing circumstances. We can mark differences between people who own their own homes and people who rent or have mortgages. And it's, as you'd imagine, somebody, even if they have a low income, if they own their home, they're less likely to be food insecure, of course, because, they've got a huge asset and they don't have the same outlay of expenditures. But we're seeing an increase in people with mortgages reporting food insecurity, which I think must relate to the increased pressure that many mortgage holders are under. But the vast majority are renters. So yeah, like it's in some ways it's who you'd expect. It's people that are, struggling to get by, whether they're in the workforce or not in the workforce, but typically not people on pensions.
When you look particularly at working age adults who hold jobs and are still food insecure, are there people who are struggling like that, who perhaps could really use the help of a food bank, but don't go either out of embarrassment or pride, or just the feeling that like that is for people who are even worse off than them?
Yeah, I'm sure all of that's true, that people maybe aren't turning up in that system, although we can see some reports, at least from some food banks, saying that they're seeing an increasing number of people who are, in the workforce, but coming to food banks for assistance. It'll be interesting to see what the statistics look like on the next Food Banks Canada report in terms of that breakdown. But the important thing to remember is that food banks are really, really stretched in terms of their resources. This is me saying this, so who knows what they would say, but I don't know that they can take that many more people. When we look at the numbers, the number of people that we identify as food insecure from these national monitoring systems is maybe 4 times or 5 times higher than the number using food banks. So some of that discrepancy must be people in the workforce that are not turning up in food banks. But, the lineups in many agencies now are around the block. And could they take 5 times more people? No, they can't, right? They're already stretched to try to meet the demand that they're seeing. So in some ways, it's okay that we've got so many people that aren't using that system because the system couldn't take them anyway.
And this is something that you got at the last time we spoke, which is that food banks are not the solution to this problem on the whole. And that's the message that you and Proof have been trying to deliver for, I guess, a few years now. Has anybody in power listened?
No, I wouldn't say so. I wish I had a different answer, but no, sadly, Jordan, I would say nobody's listened. I mean, I think there is a widespread recognition, at least federally, that food insecurity is a very serious problem in this country. But this is a complicated time politically in Canada, and we're not seeing a lot of appetite for radical new directions. So we've seen the federal government continue to make investments in infrastructure support for food charity. And in the last couple of years, as scaling up support for school feeding programs. But in terms of stepping back and taking a look at policies that would be more directly related to household food insecurity, we aren't seeing that.
What policies would be directly related to food insecurity in households?
The Canada Child Benefit is a very good example. A federal benefit that reaches, I think, more than 90% of families with children in Canada. It is scaled so that low-income families receive higher child benefits than higher-income families. But when we look at the statistics on food insecurity, the rates of food insecurity among families with children are very high. And we're still at a place, like this might shock you, but it still is true in Canada that the mere fact that a household contains somebody under the age of 18 is enough to increase their likelihood of being food insecure.
That does shock me.
Yeah, it's surprising, right? But families with children are more vulnerable than families without children. And the Canada Child Benefit should be fixing that differential, right? And it's not. So we and others have done work to look at the Canada Child Benefit and to say, well, why isn't it providing more protection? And what would it need to look like to make sure that families with children aren't food insecure? And it probably, as you could imagine, it means increasing the amount of support to the lowest income families. And I think we could do that by taking, some of the benefit away from very high income families who probably don't need it. One of the other things, the benefit provides more money for children under the age of 6, but when they turn 6, the benefit drops. So the difference is like $1,000 a year at the lowest income level. Presumably the Liberals did that because they thought they were providing money that would help pay for childcare. But when we look at families with children under the age of 6, and then, those children become 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, what we can see is that families with older children are at higher risk. The extra $1,000 actually makes quite a difference. And it's protective against food insecurity for families with younger children. So, there are details in the Canada Child Benefit that I think need to be tweaked a bit to make it more effective in protecting families against food insecurity. And especially now, as we're sitting in this extraordinarily, unprecedented period of high prices for food and other essentials, I think it's really important for governments to step back and say, okay, what are we doing and how can we be more effective in protecting people from these pressures? And the Canada Child Benefit's a perfect example of that, but it's one that is absolutely not on the table right now, I think, because of the political climate.
As we look forward, I know that the numbers you're expecting on food banks sometime next month will not be good, but there has been a lot of focus recently on falling inflation rates and lowering interest rates, both for the first time in a great while. Do those big picture economic numbers translate on the ground with the reality of food insecurity?
I think this is an important topic for us to cover because the perception could be that the fact that, interest rates are starting to fall, that inflation seems to be plateauing or falling down a little bit, that this is optimistic news, but it hasn't translated into a drop in food insecurity. And I don't think it will because prices haven't dropped. They're just not rising at the same pace they were before, right? But it's not like now that, the Bank of Canada is starting to lower interest rates, we're not going to the grocery store and seeing cheaper food on the shelves, not by a long shot. So going forward, we really have an issue of incomes not, especially those of the lowest income Canadians, incomes not having kept pace with rising costs for basic needs. And that needs to get reconciled. The fact that inflation is dampening a little bit doesn't change the problem, the fundamental problem that prices have risen substantially. They're sitting at a high level in terms of basic, essentials like food. And we need incomes to be in that same zone, and they aren't.
So what then should somebody who is food insecure do on a holiday like Thanksgiving? And I guess maybe more importantly, what should those of us who aren't be doing to help?
Well, I think the people who are food insecure just, they know better than me what to do. I think they just have to try their best. There's not much that people can do. It's really important for everybody to be filing income tax returns and to be getting help with that to make sure that if there's any benefit that they're eligible for, that they're getting it. But the truth is, the system is right now, stacked against many people. So that takes us to the people who aren't food insecure and what should we be doing? I think it's really, really important that we be communicating to our elected officials at all levels that we want to see meaningful action on this problem. And that means not public funds to support more food charity, but policy changes that will better protect people from these hardships. Because this is a serious problem. There's no question it's taking a toll on people's health and well-being. And therefore, taking a toll ultimately on our healthcare system. So it matters that we have, 8.7 million Canadians in food insecure households as of 2023, and probably more now. That matters for many, many reasons. So, we've talked about food banks. I'm not saying anything that they're not going to be saying over this Thanksgiving weekend, which is we need to see policy reforms that turn off the tap here. that deal with the problem upstream. And those of us who are food secure, it's really important that we lend our voices to that.
I asked you that last question so I could end with this, I guess. I'd just like your opinion in the big picture or existentially or whatever. Why do you think it does always come down to food charity as the solution to this? Like, why is that the first place even my mind goes when I think about, like, what can we do to help hungry people?
Well, yeah. I wish I had a better answer, Jordan, honestly. I think it's a natural kind of human reaction, right? If somebody's hungry, well, we give them food. So that's what we've been doing for decades now through food charity, right? We think, oh my goodness, somebody's going hungry. We can't allow that in our midst. So here, let's put together a gift basket for them. But what's awful about this problem is that in that very beautiful human gesture to try to, help somebody in need, that somehow that's become all that's happening. So through the Thanksgiving weekend, we're not only going to see an outpouring of support where, people who can donate their time or their money or their, food to food charities as a way to help those in need in their communities. But we're also going to see a bunch of politicians in these places getting their pictures taken. And, we're going to have footage in a few months of Justin Trudeau with his sleeves rolled up. And who knows whether Pierre Poilievre will also be in one of these places over the weekend getting his picture taken. But, everybody wants to be part of the story that is we're helping those in need. We're compassionate people. But there's a problem in Canada, and it's a very real problem that somehow that's as far as the conversation has gotten. And I think with these numbers being so high and with food banks so clearly saying they can't cope, I think that the pendulum has to start to swing now in another direction. So, what I really hope happens over this weekend, I think when those elected officials show up in these places to get their pictures taken, I really hope that they're sent away and somebody sends them packing with the message like, no, guys, we actually need you to do the other job, which is to turn off the tap here. And, we can sort the food or we can carry these boxes in, but we need the people we've elected to work on policies that better support Canadians in this time of high prices.
Val, thank you so much for this.
Well, thank you for your continued interest in this topic. Part of the solution, I really think, Jordan, is that we talk about it.
Dr. Valerie Tarasuk of Proof and the University of Toronto. That was the big story. For more, including the previous interview I mentioned with Dr. Tarasuk, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can shoot us any feedback you have on this episode or any other at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us at 416-935-5935. Speaking of feedback, that's what we will have for you this Monday, as we do on most holidays, a feedback episode with me and Joe. We've got a couple of other treats in the feed for you this weekend. Joe Fish is the lead producer of this show. Robin Simon is also a producer. Matt Kesselman handles our sound design. Mary Jubrin is our audience development lead. Diana Kay is our manager of business development. And I'm your host and executive producer, Jordan Heath Rawlings. Together, that makes us the Frequency Podcast Network, which is a division of Rogers. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back with a fresh big story on Tuesday. And we'll talk then.